Hello, I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. It's wonderful to have you all joining us here today. We're excited to have an all-day symposium on prosperity and human security, Japan and Asia's 21st century governance challenges. This is really a wonderful opportunity to bring together a top set of scholars to engage with our associates, the wider community joining us by Zoom, on a set of important topics for the region. This is an opportunity to bring to you the speakers as part of our special series on policy innovations and crises, which is supported by a very generous grant from the Japan Foundation. Our event today is co-sponsored by the Harvard University Asia Center, the Takemi Program in International Health, the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, the Harvard University Center for the Environment, and our Harvard Undergraduate Japan Policy Network. This event takes place against the backdrop of increasing leadership by Japan and also a recognition that security foreign policy leadership requires more than just looking at defense networks and trade ties. And we have a much broader sense of what is the important issues to bring security and prosperity to a region. We see, as Japan is preparing to host the G7 summit in Hiroshima coming this year, that Prime Minister Kishida is launching many initiatives to frame how Japan is exercising leadership. And one of his first endeavors at this public outreach was to have an article published in Lancet, which is really quite remarkable for a Japanese prime minister, on human security and universal health coverage, Japan's vision for the G7 Hiroshima summit, which really rolls out this idea of universal health coverage and the primacy that Japan sees in its role as a leader on healthcare, as well as, of course, a broader range of economic and security issues. And so today we're going to try and take on this agenda of looking at Japan's evolving role in East Asia with attention to public health and the broader environment and climate change. These are important areas for international development and cooperation. We've long looked to Japan's emergence as a developmental state, how its policies towards industrial development, addressing sustainable development as its industrial success led to environmental problems, and improving the quality of lives for its people. All of these benchmarks that Japan has met have also been passed on to the other countries of East Asia, South Korea, Southeast Asia, Taiwan, and China. These countries have both benefited from receiving Japanese foreign aid, they have learned from lessons by the Japanese government, and they've innovated to change and improve on any model that may have come from Japan. So that today, when we look at East Asia, we see many countries that have become middle income and are very prosperous. With that prosperity, they can become more ambitious about what is the goal. It's not just high income growth, but also a higher quality of life. And that means more attention to the environment and public health and regional cooperation, because one clearly cannot achieve health or environmental progress without cooperating as a region. So in achieving these goals, what is Japan's role? How can Japan contribute to Asia? How has China emerged as a leader in these topics? We're excited to sponsor two events addressing these policies on public health, environmental policy, and broader efforts at regional cooperation in East Asia. We're going to start off at noon with our first panel on development governance challenges in public health. We'll take a break after that for lunch, and then we'll come back at 3 o'clock with our second panel, which will be on, where's my title? Second panel, Development, Climate Change, and Climate Migration. But let me begin first introducing our panelists for the discussion on challenges in public health. We're going to begin with Kathryn Ibata-Arens, who is the Vincent DePaul Professor of Political Science at DePaul University. Perhaps coming from Chicago, the cold weekend was not unusual for us here in Boston. It was even colder than usual. But she is a leading expert on high technology, entrepreneurship, biomedical innovation in Japan and Asia. She's written an incredible array of books on these topics. Innovation and Entrepreneurship in Japan, published by Cambridge in 2005. Beyond Techno-Nationalism, Biomedical Innovation, published by Stanford in 2019, and most recently, Pandemic Medicine, Why the Global Innovation System is Broken and How We Can Fix It, just released in 2021 by Lynn Reiner. This was named the best book in global health by the International Studies Association, and I look forward to reading it, but we're going to hear some of her great ideas today about Japan innovation, improving health and medicine in the developing world. After Professor Ibata-Arens, we will next move on to Professor Yanzhong Huang, who is the Senior Fellow for Global Health at Council of Foreign Relations, where he directs the Global Health Governance Roundtable Series. He is also professor at Seton Hall University School of Diplomacy and International Relations, where he directs global health studies, which is actually really remarkable. It's one of the first concentrations to merge professional international affairs schools with a focus on foreign policy and health issues. Professor Huang has written extensively on health issues, including books on governing health in contemporary China, toxic politics, China's environmental health crisis, and most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic and China's global health leadership, which came out from the CFR just last year. His talk will look at China's COVID-19 and global health governance. Our third panelist, wrapping things up, will be Joseph Wong, who is the Ralph Halbert Professor of Innovation at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, where he is professor in the Department of Political Science, Vice President, International Affairs at the University of Toronto. He has published extensively on a whole range of topics from healthcare to democratization in East Asia. He is the author of Healthy Democracies, Welfare Politics in Taiwan and South Korea. Another book, Betting in Biotech, Innovation and Limits of Asia's Developmental State from Cornell in 2011. Most recently, writing with Dan Slater, From Development to Democracy, The Transformations of Modern Asia from Princeton Press, published just last year. He's going to be talking about universalism and governance in the post-pandemic moment. As you can see, we have a great set of speakers, also have many in the audience with questions. Each of our speakers will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion from the audience, both in person and online. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Thank you to our hosts, Drs. Christina Davis and Shinji Fujihira, and of course to the program and U.S.-Japan relations sponsors, including the Japan Foundation. I'd like to make a special thanks to Jennifer Christ, who has brought us all together today, made sure that we got here on time and knew where we were going. And then, of course, a recognition of the senior leadership of Dr. Susan Farr behind all of these wonderful initiatives over time. I would like to say that today I'm drawing on the conceptual framework for the book that was just mentioned, Pandemic Medicine, Why the Global Innovation System is Broken and How We Can Fix It. After sharing the global context and the book's analytical framework, I will conclude with a few highlights about Japan's innovations in health diplomacy. This book, Pandemic Medicine, follows from my 2019 Stanford University Press book, in which I cited Dr. Joe Wong's book on betting on biotech liberally, so I encourage you to read that, and also his book, excellent book, by Cornell, I think. Okay. In that book, Beyond Techno-Nationalism, I analyzed national government policy and entrepreneur firm-level strategy in stimulating innovation and entrepreneurship in products for human health. Pandemic Medicine, in turn, analyzes the possibilities for open innovation at a global level, our innovation system for all people. I am honored that Pandemic Medicine, as was pointed out before, was awarded the best book in global health by the International Studies Association, so I'm very excited about that. But let me give you some background. In 2016, I was in India interviewing biopharmaceutical scientists and entrepreneurs. You might know this history, but I was quite shocked to learn that the pharmaceutical company Pfizer had essentially created the WTO TRIPS agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. In short, it's called WTO TRIPS. It was a way specifically to exclude Indian biopharmaceutical companies from WTO markets, which are most of the markets of the world, by the way, all of the industrialized democracies. Excluding the Indian biopharmaceutical companies from making generic antibiotics and selling them at cost for the developing world. Nelson Mandela was sued by Pfizer and some others. They failed in that suit. I could talk about that in the Q&A. That was for HIV/AIDS antiretrovirals. But in any case, behind all this Children were dying because of this keeping of the patented science and technology within the global market. Why would Pfizer do this? They did it because there was money to be made, and that's understandable. They're a corporation. They made these monies on their monopoly patents for these kinds of drugs. The pharmaceutical lobby tells us that without patents, there would be no new innovation. Not true. Industry data, in fact, shows that more than 75% of research and development spending goes, in fact, into quote-unquote evergreening patents. That is, patents on minuscule molecular level tweaks to existing drugs. How does this not very innovative innovation system continue to survive? Well, for example, by 2020 alone, the drug lobby had spent a record $309 million to cement the status quo of a patent-centric global IPR system. Its latest target at the time, preventing COVID-19 vaccine know-how from being shared with the neediest countries. Meanwhile, Pfizer, one of the three major COVID-19 vaccine makers, reported more than an $11 billion profit on the COVID-19 vaccine in just the first 6 months of 2021, right in the middle of the height of the pandemic. By the next year, 2022, Pfizer reported the highest annual earnings of any pharma company ever. Its $100 billion profit, this is after, not gross revenue, but profit, was thanks mainly, not surprisingly, to sales of its COVID-19 vaccine, as well as its COVID treatment Paxlovid. It need not be said that Pfizer did not invent its own COVID-19 vaccine. Rather, Pfizer bought it, it acquired it from BioNTech, whose discoveries themselves were based on German government-funded research. Many medical discoveries in the 20th century have been shared in the public commons, ensuring fair and equitable access to essential medicines. Discoveries were shared in this public commons, meaning their inventors never sought to patent them. These have included the first antibiotic penicillin, among many others. The story of insulin is similar, which I could discuss in the Q&A if you like. For lack of time, I took that part out. Meanwhile, potentially life-saving natural medicines are disappearing due to biodiversity loss and quote-unquote biopiracy, just as we are entering an age of pandemics. If anyone read this Sunday's New York Times, there was an article about, of all things, mink farms in Spain. What do mink farms in Spain have to do with global viral pandemics? Well, what's going on these farms in Spain is what is called zoonosis. It wasn't brought up in the article, that term, but zoonosis, meaning it's moving from birds to small mammals, and that is where it can make the leap into human populations. The most virulent forms of this strain, H1N1, H1N2, et cetera, can kill up to 55% of all people who become inflicted with it. This is a major specter on the horizon right now in front of us. So why is it fair to say that we are in fact in an age of pandemics, not just a temporary thing? This is not going to go away. We're not going to get out of this COVID-19 pandemic and wash our hands of it and be fine forever. It is because, in fact, the frequency and severity of viral, but also bacterial disease is spreading across borders. It's increasing. And in fact, scientists and epidemiologists, et cetera, anticipate that these outbreaks will continue to worsen due to loss of biodiversity that is bringing human populations in close proximity to the wild animals, such as those minks I just mentioned, and the dangerous microbes that harbor disease in these environments. In fact, in the last 10 years alone, at least 5 viral diseases have reached epidemic proportions. The current novel coronavirus is merely the latest mutation. So rather than have an open innovation commons inclusive, for example, of stakeholders with a sense of noblesse oblige, we have instead a system that has proven itself woefully unprepared in the current pandemic, fragmented and siloed. Instead of coordinate efforts under an inclusive architecture of open innovation, we instead have what I call crisis innovation, trying to bring diagnostics and treatments to patients around the world, particularly the global south, which is still suffering. Some of my friends in countries in Africa and South Asia have only had 2 jabs. I've had 5, which is an example of varying levels of competency and national leadership and international cooperation. So in the book Pandemic Medicine, I find that on the bright side, emergent organizations in countries such as China, India, and Japan are including certain public private partnerships, which are doing their part to foster innovation that is open and also inclusive, while encouraging sharing in a meso-level commons. COVID-19 is the second SARS virus. The first hit China in 2002. At the time, the spread was checked because scientists were able to map the genomic structure of the virus quickly, having already been collaborating on the Human Genome Project. The Human Genome Project brought together researchers from all over the world, in fact, transcending national and institutional boundaries with a common goal of mapping the entire human genome. The innovation architecture of the HGP, as it was called for short, can be described, in fact, as an open innovation commons. A commons, a la Elinor Ostrom, is a space where a public good can be accessed by all. An innovation commons is a space where new ideas and novel discoveries are shared as a public good. New drug discovery for essential medicines is an issue area that illuminates the normative significance and moral economy of the commons. Data indicates that natural medicines and the knowledge about them held in the innovation commons have contributed, this is the thousand millennia, have contributed to more than half of the patented drugs currently on the market. Some estimate this is closer to 70% of all patented drugs. So let's take us back to the precursor epidemic of SARS in 2002. It was contained. Why? Hospitals in mainland China, Guangzhou and Guangdong province in particular, included natural, non-synthetic, plant-based medicines in the treatment course. This is demonstrated from clinical studies, by the way. The mortality and morbidity rate in areas treating patients with natural, sometimes called traditional medicine, was significantly better than regions that did not. Natural medicines are not patented. In fact, could not be patented until now. It used to be that you could not patent nature. Patents were never granted on living things. Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine, asked in 1954 why he did not seek a patent for his invention, responded, "Can you patent the sun?" Flash forward to SARS-2 or COVID-19, and we have a global innovation system that was fragmented by a patent-centric intellectual property rights regime that discourages sharing. Meanwhile, most of the world's population, 85%, according to the World Health Organization, depends on natural medicines for their basic healthcare needs. These issues are very complex and interconnected, as this Venn diagram shows, and I'd love to discuss this in greater detail in the Q&A. Natural medicines, the foundation for all medicines, depend on plant genetic biodiversity. If most of humanity depends on them for basic healthcare, then it makes sense that innovations for new drugs should be inclusive of the ways in which natural medicine has been shared in the innovation commons, what I call an open innovation sandbox. What we have now, unfortunately, remains a system of silos, enclosing the innovation commons for medicine discovery. Patenting the natural biologic world enriches pharmaceutical companies while human health suffers. I know that I spent most of this time framing the issue, so let me turn now to potential solutions based on original fieldwork in Asia from 2016 to 2020. In fact, I had planned some research in South Korea and Taiwan that was canceled due to the pandemic, so the book itself is only about China, India, and Japan, unfortunately. So how can we unpack these complex issues of seeking policy solutions that work for national governments, as well as articulate up to multilateral organizations and other transnational networks? One way is through analyzing emergent organizations. These innovative organizations are the subject of chapters in the book about policy experiments underway by national governments in China, India, and Japan, as I mentioned before, in partnership, but unfortunately sometimes at odds with certain private sector and transnational actors. Each of these case studies has had a goal of serving human health by developing novel medicines and/or protecting and conserving natural medicine knowledge and plant genomic materials for medicines. Benefited from that, in fact, in Seoul when I became ill on my way to a Mansfield event, which is another organization in which Dr. Halbert is involved. A pattern emerges in the way these organizations structure their innovation activities. I call them innovation sandboxes and pools. As this typology of innovation system architectures, or TISA for short, shows, sandboxes provide a structure or structured play to coax participants, be they national governments, firms, or foundations, to collaborate in an approximation of an open innovation commons in the aim of novel medicine discoveries. Intellectual property pools, typically pools of patents or other compound libraries, are also a meso step or approach towards greater sharing across institutional boundaries. Framing the analysis of emergent organizations in a political sciencey typology, as we say, a typology matrix, which is popular in my field, it helps to situate cases which also are quantitatively backed by the evidence, if you read the book, along a continuum of high to low novelty and high to low openness or inclusivity, as we see in the public commons. In sum, it is not only about removing the fences around the sandbox of innovative activity, but also inviting a greater breadth of stakeholders to play in it. That is, the global IPR regime remains firmly in the grip of the WTO TRIPS. In turn, behind TRIPS are pharmaceutical and other corporations with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The last thing they want is transformational and inclusive change, nor do they want to see any push for a sui generis intellectual property rights regime, as China has indicated it might seek through its quote unquote proactive protection of vast natural medicine corpus. Rather than dwell any further on what is wrong with our global innovation system and the misbehaving players within it, let me turn now to some optimism for our future in emergent organizations operating in open innovative spaces of sandboxes and also pools. The Global Innovative Technology Fund, GHIT as it's called, is a partnership in Japan between the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, Takeda and other pharmaceutical companies, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, a UK foundation, and the United Nations Development Program. Lots of players there. And they are discovering new essential medicines for neglected tropical diseases for the developing world, called NTDs. Its first round of investments was launched in April 2013, and since, several promising diagnostics and therapies are in the pipeline for malaria, tuberculosis, and also dengue fever. In addition, a pediatric drug for treating the deadly parasitic infection schistosomiasis has completed clinical trials and is ready for market as I speak. Another initiative in Japan, sponsored by also Takeda Pharmaceutical, is called the Takeda Garden for Medicinal Plant Conservation, nestled in the beautiful northern mountains of Kyoto, my favorite place in the world after Paris. Maybe first before Paris. I've been spending a lot of time in Paris lately, as you knows. But in my heart and soul, Kyoto is my favorite place. I raised my children there, for example. But anyhow, back to my talk. While the Takeda Kyoto Garden functions primarily as a demonstration garden for local schools and universities, including pharmacists in training, in fact, Japanese national law requires that all pharmacists in pharmacy school must have part of the curriculum learning about natural medicines and the wild, but also cultivars of these medicines. The only place in the world of which I'm aware that pharmacists must learn about the natural origins of medicines. The Takeda Kyoto Garden also preserves medicinal plant biodiversity via seed and rhizome bank. This effort by Takeda is noteworthy because it is decoupled from the profit of the company. In fact, natural medicines comprise 0.5% of the current profit of the company, although Takeda was actually originally a seller of kampo, traditional Chinese medicine in Osaka. They have since grown into a global synthetic pharmaceutical company. So this is noteworthy because it serves the Japanese notion of nen no tame, conservation for its own sake, just in case of a presently unknown need in the future. So Japan's approaches to our global innovation commons are pragmatic. As such, Japan remains mostly in the quadrant of the pools of the TISA, though its quasi-open sharing of existing discoveries and making incremental innovations to current technologies is also noteworthy. I would be happy to discuss other cases in China, India, and also Japan, other cases in Japan during the Q&A time. Of course, the greatest detail about these emergent organizations supporting open innovation is found in the book, Pandemic Medicine. With this, I will close and thank you for your feedback.
You. Well, Well, thank you again for inviting me to this conference. I actually learned a lot from Kathryn's presentation. And I'm going to talk about a slightly different topic, which is about China's ambitions to seek global health leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic. Prior to the, yes, forgive me for those typos, I just realized 1 second ago, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Beijing was expanding its engagement in global health governance by moving to the net donor status. That process started in 2010, essentially. It became more active in global health agenda setting and norm development. Remember, in 2006, right, they mobilized all the resources, talking about billions of dollars, right, to elect Margaret Chan, a Hong Kong Chinese national, to be the WHO Director General, essentially beating out 12 highly qualified candidates to get that position. And in 2012, essentially she ran unopposed, because as one of the insiders told me, there was other people there were no other candidates essentially that feel like they were fighting an unwinnable fight, right? So they just gave up. And also, right, even under the Dr. Tedros, China was also working successfully to include the traditional Chinese medicine, right, in the WHO's influential global medical compendium. And beginning 2013, they launched new initiatives, right, called the Health Silk Road, essentially by using those BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, transportation networks, railroads, right, airports, logistics hubs, right, to provide medical and healthcare assistance, to other countries, especially, of course, those countries that are participating in the BRI. Well, still, right, by 2020, right, China did not really exhibit any notable leadership in global health, right? Its contribution to global health remained limited, symbolic, largely, and constrained by domestic public health challenges. Just to give you an example, prior to 2020, China contributed only 1.5% of the total WHO budget, right? Compared with 16% from the United States, 3.8% from Japan. But the COVID-19 pandemic provides China a perfect opportunity, right, to achieve its global health leadership ambitions. Its early comparative success in quickly controlling the spread of COVID-19 in the spring of 2020, emboldened Beijing to transform that success, right, to opportunities for global health leadership. And that, of course, also, right, they feel like compelled to do so, in part because, in the spring 2020, this according to a Tsinghua University study, there's the international. There seems to be a significant increase in negative international opinion of China. In the discussions increasingly dominated by issues related to Chinese politics and foreign policy during the pandemic. So this campaign essentially has three themes. One, promote the so-called China solution to the pandemic, right? They started to encourage actually the government officials, nationalist intellectuals, started to promote, right, the other countries to copy the so-called copy and paste, right? The Chinese approach to the pandemic, that is, like lockdowns, traditional Chinese medicine. I remember it was the spring, I attended a Zoom conference hosted by a China-based think tank. There was leading China think tank scholars, seems to be very bewildered, that why, other countries were so silly, we have such a easy, the playbook, right? Why they choose not to adopt it, and secondly, they try to portray China, as a leader in providing critical medical supplies, masks, PPE, and of course the vaccines. This is what we call the mask diplomacy and vaccine diplomacy. And finally, they want to shape the global health agenda in China's favor. That is particularly, I will use that example, on these disputing the COVID, the origin of the COVID probe. So the first of the China solution to the pandemic, this is basically what China's solution is zero COVID, right? That approach initially indeed was successful in terms of sustaining extremely low level of infection and mortality, right? Until mid-November, for example, China still had only 1.1 million cases. That is 1.1% of the total global cases. Right? And they recorded 5,226 COVID deaths, that, again, by mid-November 2022, that was only 0.5% of the US level, and of course, only a very small fraction of the worldwide COVID death, which is 6.61 million. Even the wealthy nations seems to approve China's success, right? If you, according to the Pew survey, right, in the summer 2020, the percentage of responders across the 14 OECD countries that say China had done a good job addressing the pandemic. The percentage increased to close to half, right, 50% in the spring of 2021, compared with only a median of 37% who said the same thing on the United States. So China actually was able to improve its image, right? Sort of projected its soft power, during the early stage, right? This in 2020, right? During the pandemic. And but since the summer of 2021, right, with the arrival of highly transmissible variants, first Delta, then Omicron, but of course, especially after the Shanghai lockdown, international reverence for Beijing's zero COVID approach dropped significantly, right? In fact, in May 2022, the WHO, the Tedros, actually called China's zero COVID not sustainable. Right? And of course, China said what he said was irresponsible, right? But on December 7th, 2022, China essentially abandoned zero COVID, adopted a let it rip approach, right? Approach that it was so disgusted with, right? They actually vowed to say, we're never going to lie flat, right? That approach only belonged to the Western countries. But in fact, after December 7th, they adopted an approach that seems to be more extreme than the Western countries have been taking. So this first theme was that the efforts to promote the China solution didn't work. Right? Second, when you look at this efforts to project the image of China being this, the provider of global public goods, that of course started in May 2020 when President Xi, well, actually even before that, right, it was China already was exporting masks, right, to other countries, right, including those in the Western world, right. China became the largest, I think, 40% of the global supply of masks actually from China. And in May 2021, May 2020, President Xi, said, China, want to make the vaccines the global public good, right? And by mid-March 2021, China had already produced about 1/3 of the world's vaccine doses. And 1 year later, Beijing had donated 2.1 billion doses of vaccines to 120 countries that accounted for 1/3 of the vaccines used worldwide, excluding China. Right? And the Latin America, and the Southeast Asia, they become the regions that received most of the Chinese vaccines. For a time, Indonesia, 80% of the vaccines came from China. So that was quite impressive. But again, with the arrival of these highly transmissible variants, the recipient countries began to move away from Chinese vaccines in summer 2021. Right? There was a survey conducted by Southeast Asian Institute in Singapore. They found, that the Pfizer and Moderna, right, is the most trusted vaccine brands, even among, Southeast Asian countries, right? And China's, Sinovac, only like 19% say, this is the most trusted vaccines. When I was in Indonesia last November, I was told by a think tank, a scholar said, we appreciate what China has been doing us, but we still prefer the U.S. vaccines. And essentially, right, the beginning of October 2021, again, that was the time of when we saw that the highly transmissible variant become dominant in many countries, right? We saw, but not surprisingly, a significant drop, right, of the delivery of the Chinese vaccines in almost all the countries, right, the recipient countries. And actually by March, right, that China's vaccine diplomacy essentially came to an end. And no countries wanted Chinese vaccines anymore. Right? That is March 2022. Again, that is the time we saw like Omicron variant was like everywhere. Right? And it also didn't really, even though China was very generous, like in Southeast Asia, for example, it was still not viewed as the most trusted major power. Right? Japan consistently was the most trusted major power among Southeast Asians, right? Beginning 2020 until through 2022. Right? The third, when we talk about so the second theme also didn't work out, right? The third one was they tried to shape the agenda of the pandemic region's growth, actually in the beginning again, in early March, but they started to dispute, right, that officially contained that the pandemic was proven to have been the origin point of the pandemic. When the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said that simply by the pandemic started in Wuhan doesn't necessarily mean that we are the origin point of the pandemic, right? That it seems that that this is quite this narrative was widely accepted right in China, right? And nowadays, I think probably 90% of the Chinese people would agree with what the government say, but and internationally, right? That they were Australia initiated that this WHO, right, the resolution, right, to send a team of experts to China to conducted the probe, the investigation, but China initially gained a clear upper hand in the negotiation with the WHO on the terms and the timing of the investigation, right? So when they finally arrived in China, they spent 4 weeks there, including 2 weeks on the Zoom, right? 2 weks visiting Wuhan, and this conclusion was that the WHO China joint study in the spring of 2021 actually allowed Beijing to claim a public relations victory, because the report essentially supported all Beijing say, right? This lab leak theory is extremely unlikely. There could be also this cold chain products, right, spreading, transmitting the virus, right? This is clearly a zoonotic event, something like that. But efforts to reshape the narrative on the origins of the pandemic also triggered a very strong international backlash, especially with the release of that WHO China joint study in the spring of 2021, by even Dr. Tedros had to, keep the distance from that investigation, say, every option is still on the table, and they became instead, since spring 2021, pressed China to be more forthcoming, to be more transparent with data and information related to the origin of the virus. And of course, now, just heard, right, the US Congress has launched the sweeping probe of the COVID origins. So even that, but we found that China's this efforts to reshape the global health agenda has not been very successful. Actually, we have seen the WHO's relationship with China being soured, right, over that issue. So to quickly conclude, the COVID-19 pandemic indeed provide China opportunity to pursue its global ambitions, like global health leadership. There was some initial gains, but by the end of 2022, it was clear that Beijing's campaign to seek global health leadership had not been successful, right? And China's vulnerability in maneuvering for global health leadership, therefore, presents the United States, Japan, and other Western countries an opportunity to advance their own leadership agenda. So with that, we can do stuff. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So this is just one slide that I'll make reference to way later on in my comments. So please don't be distracted in the meantime. Let me begin by just thanking the organizers for this terrific opportunity and invitation to be here. I was just reminiscing with Christina that I used to hang out outside of 1737 back in 1999 and 2000 when I was a researcher here at the Fairbanks Center, and I met great people, but not Christina, which much to my chagrin, but really lifelong friends. And it's truly a treat and an honor to be able to be back here. It was a different building back then, so I did get a little bit lost before I got here. It's also exciting because, as it happens, Dan Slater, the co-author of our most recent book, is actually giving a talk on our book tomorrow at the Ash Center. So if you want to check that out, you guys might want to do that. I won't be there, but Dan's a much more colorful speaker than me. But I should also preface my comments by saying that the focus on Japan, I think, is absolutely critical. I've had the opportunity to participate in several universal health coverage gatherings and convenings in Japan. And the initial visits were always quite startling in terms of the kind of role and the leadership role that Japan was playing in this space. But over the years, it's quite clear that the thinking that's going on in Japan and the commitment that we're seeing now, for instance, in the agenda setting power it has at the G7, speaks volumes about the role that Japan can play in terms of global health leadership. And Yanzhong's point about an opportunity for other countries to rise in this global leadership role. I winced a little when I saw the US listed there, but it made a good deal of sense that Japan was there. So my comments are going to be more conceptual. When I saw the slides that everyone else had presented, I shuddered a little because I thought, wow, there's such empirical rigor to all of these presentations, and mine is going to be considerably more loosey-goosey. So you'll have to accept my apologies in advance. It's really going to be more of a conversation of big ideas and some concepts that I've been mulling over the last several years during and in the wake of the pandemic. So of course, the pandemic has provided for us, a tremendous opportunity to rethink and redo how we engage in questions of governance more generally and health governance more specifically. And there's a real transformational potential here, I think, for policymakers and policy doers around the world. When I think back to March of 2020, and I also have an administrative role as one of the VPs of U of T, so immediately your administrative instinct kicks in, and it's a question of what are we going to do over the course of a weekend in order to get our university on track and operating from Thursday to Monday. So lots of observations and thinking going on right at the very beginning of the pandemic. And I want to offer just a couple of them here for you, just to get a sense of where we were and what we were thinking at the time. The first is I recall a good friend of mine who I was co-teaching a course with, she's in engineering. She said, you know, Joe, this is going to be really interesting because we are going to see science being unveiled in real time. And at the time I thought, oh, well, that's kind of profound, but I didn't really understand the implications of that until we saw essentially science being rolled out in real time and the debates that are very much part of the scientific discovery process being played out in real time and for all to see. And we know the complications that ensued as a result of that. The second observation is that early on, the national responses to containing COVID was really quite variable. Right? When you look, there were various institutions around the world that were tracking different policies and guidelines and regulations in response to COVID, and you saw considerable variance across all of these cases as different countries responded in different ways, reflective of their different capacities, their different predispositions, and so forth, including, for instance, in the case of China. But over time, we do see convergence, and I think that's also quite interesting, because it speaks to the length of the pandemic, but also the need for solutions that are replicable and repeatable. And I think that's where China does stand out until very recently. So while the rest of the world was really converging in its responses, China continued to stand out in large part because its solutions, frankly, are very hard to replicate for a whole host of reasons. And some of them have already been brought out by Yanzhong in this presentation. The third thing was at the time, it was really unclear as to how long this pandemic was going to be. Some of you who are parents of young kids who were at school, thought, well, this is just a couple of weeks and they'll be back in school. Well, those couple of weeks turn into now 3 years. And so that places a premium then on governance mechanisms that are not only responding to a particular moment, but ones that are repeatable over time. Right? And that's really critical, responses that are repeatable over time. And the last observation I'd make in the initial stage was that while this may have seemed to be unprecedented at the time, it really wasn't. This was not the first time that countries had experienced something like this. And indeed, one of the key points that I'd like to stress is that lessons learned from previous pandemics and those countries that were able to learn lessons from previous pandemics fared much better in the early goings of COVID. Notably, for instance, places like Taiwan and South Korea. Taiwan, having experienced SARS, it's incredible how much SARS permeated through policy discussions within the Ministry of Health in Taiwan in terms of its response. And of course, we know in Taiwan after SARS in 2003, it immediately set up within a year or two a whole host of institutional infrastructures, including command central epidemic mechanisms, command mechanisms as it relates to communications, and so forth. A lot of these preparedness plans were put into place very shortly after the 2003 pandemic. The lessons were learned very quickly thereafter. The same with South Korea and MERS in 2015. Again, when one looks at all of the documents, talks to people in South Korea, reads the news in South Korea, you know that MERS had a tremendous impact on the way in which the government responded to COVID, and indeed reflected a lot of the institutional changes that emerged in the wake of MERS. So that's the first thing. Lessons to be learned in the immediate post-pandemic moment, and the inability, frankly, of most countries around the world to learn those lessons. In Canada, in the wake of SARS, we too had a Royal Commission on SARS, and one of the chief recommendations was increasing our surge capacity in our critical care units and our hospitals. Made a lot of sense in the post-SARS moment. This made a lot of logical sense. We never made the investments. In other words, there's a very short window of opportunity in which public policymakers can make these changes when, as one of my colleagues puts it, the soft is still clay. And yet, for a whole host of political and administrative reasons, we tend not to. I think part of it is psychological. We want the pandemic to be over, right? We want to be as far away from it as we possibly can be. An almost kind of PTSD reaction where we want to put this in the rearview mirror as quickly as possible. And therefore, we move back into a normal form of politics, which precludes then our ability and political willingness to make the changes that are required. Second thing that I would point out, again, with respect to Taiwan and South Korea, is that their ability to have responded very well to the pandemic early on was a reflection of the investments that they had made in their healthcare system. And I've written a little bit about this in terms of the universalization of national health insurance in both Taiwan and South Korea, which not only included the universalization of the provision of medical care through a single pipe payment system, but also the creation of a very sophisticated form of interoperable data sharing across various units. This was absolutely critical in the early stages of containing COVID, whether it be the interoperability data sharing between immigration services and the healthcare system, whether it be in terms of rationing out, for instance, PPEs and masks and the ability of the Taiwan system to do that, or maintaining very elaborate electronic medical health records so that the health system was able to keep up with treatments in the early period of the pandemic. So again, the healthcare infrastructure mattered a great deal in how places like Taiwan and South Korea were able to confront COVID. Lastly, they responded early and they responded quickly. I don't need to go too much into this. We know, for instance, in the case of the United States, the unwillingness or inability to react quickly, to respond quickly and early has been a serious problem. So the key point that I want to make so far to stress is that there are a lot of old lessons that we have been able to learn from previous pandemics and epidemics. And in many regards, what we're learning or relearning again in the wake of the post-COVID moment are nothing new. The question, of course, that I put to this group, and I think that we'll all need to wrestle with, is will governments actually respond? And indeed, I think a really worthwhile political science question would be, why do governments learn and why do governments not learn? And I think that would be a really great doctoral dissertation for anyone interested. And yet, I think there's a lot new going on in COVID, and this is really what I wanted to focus my comments on. So what COVID demonstrated, I think, was one, a virus that really quickly spread. Right? So this was spreading at a pace that was unimaginable prior to that. The second was the rate at which the virus was mutating. So it was not only spreading very quickly in the sense that it was easily transmissible, but the mutations and the quick mutations meant that it was eluding a lot of the kinds of assumptions we build into the development of herd immunity. Right? So it was kind of dodging as a virus and able to outwit, if you will, the assumptions of herd immunity. And lastly, its asymptomatic nature really was a problem, right? Because this was something that we know contributed to the really rapid transmission of COVID and ultimately also the mutations. This was significant, I think, for one fundamental reason. My epidemiologist friends tell me that herd immunity can generally be achieved for most viruses when the population is either vaccinated or have been infected at around 60 to 70%. Right, so that's the going sort of rate, if you will. Once the population, 60 to 70%, have either been infected with the virus or have been vaccinated, then we should start seeing the effects of herd immunity and therefore then the end, if you will, of the pandemic. COVID presented to us a totally different set of circumstances. You'll recall in the early discussions, for instance, around vaccination rates, national goals were not set at vaccination rates of 60 to 70%, which would have been the epidemiological standard. In fact, in the case of Ontario, it was 92% plus. In other words, what was good enough in the past in terms of public health measure of vaccination, required vaccinations of 60 to 70% of the population, meant now we basically had to vaccinate everybody. And this is the core of what I want to get at in terms of governance, health governance, and the future of health governance in the post-pandemic moment is the distinction between real universalism or true empirical universalism, that is to say, reaching everybody, versus policies and programs that have historically been good enough. And the implications of this in terms of health governance and global governance more generally, I think, are quite profound. As we've already seen in Kathryn's excellent presentation in the international arena, right? The incentives, for instance, that are built into the TRIPS agreement and the incentives that are built into the sort of market failures of the pharmaceutical sector are such that universalism is actually very elusive. It's very difficult to achieve the universal production and distribution of vaccines. We've seen also, for a whole host of logistical reasons, as well as economic reasons, the challenges of actually delivering vaccines to those, to everyone, not just those most in need, literally to everyone. Right? Vaccine nationalism, my country, Canada, is just as guilty as the rest, in the sense that our government in Canada procured 3 to 4 times the number of vaccines that were actually required and ordered them and held them back from some of our obligations for countries that are in the low and middle income country world. The problem of exclusion, for instance, is even more pronounced, right? And we've seen, I think, quite happily from my point of view, and I would imagine colleagues in Taiwan, a movement now to ensure the inclusion of Taiwan, for instance, in WHO conversations at a rate and at a level of engagement that we've never seen before. Why? Because again, when it comes to a pandemic, everybody has to be included and everybody has to be engaged, right? Any weakness in one of the links of that chain can be disastrous for the entire world. This is where mutations occur and so forth. So at a global level, one can see the profound implications of a policy goal to reach everybody as opposed to policy goals that are good enough. The second way in which we think about this, and this is reflective of some of the research that I've been engaged with over the last several years, is the need to reach then those that are the hardest to reach within a society. And my first book was actually on healthy democracies. It was on welfare politics in Taiwan and South Korea. And it really told quite a happy story about the so-called universalization of health insurance in both places. But a really blistering critique of the book, and one that's always bothered me throughout the years, although I didn't really address it until more recently, was when people said, you know, you tell a happy story of inclusion for about 90% of the population, but that 5 to 10% of the population continue to be systematically excluded. Right? So your notion of universalism actually is not actually universalism. It's a good enough form of universalism, but it's not actually reaching every single person. In the case of Taiwan, we know the systematic exclusion, for instance, of indigenous peoples is a reality. We know that in terms of health outcomes, as well as in terms of health access, rural elderly people enjoy lower access to the healthcare system in Taiwan than do other folks living on the island. Right? Having spent some time then shadowing mobile health clinics in the mountainous regions of eastern Taiwan that were visiting and engaging with indigenous communities, I got a real sense of just how hard it is to actually reach these communities that had historically been excluded. This is what's inspired the work that I've engaged with over the last 6 or 7 years now. It's called the Reach Alliance. And the question is, how do we reach those who are the hardest to reach? Those who are the poorest of the poor, most geographically remote, marginalized, the excluded, and so forth. We know in the case of South Korea, for instance, if you are informally employed, you are 30% less likely to enjoy the benefits of old age income security or any of the other social security programs and social insurance programs that have been put into place. So again, universalism in name, that is good enough, and real universalism in terms of reaching everybody. So the Reach Alliance is a project that is looking at this question of how do you reach those that are hardest to reach. Most recently, for instance, we did a report on vaccine distribution to remote indigenous communities in Northern Ontario. These are fly-in communities. These are communities that are not accessible by road. They are communities that are sparsely populated. And yet at the same time, in the interest and in the name of universal vaccination, they had to be reached. And so you saw a very complicated and complex logistical system put in place in order to do that. The point here is that new technology technologies, new policies, and new programs, and new politics need to be thought through if we are indeed aiming to reach those who are hardest to reach. And it's nowhere clearer than in this one graph here, which is the last thing I want to comment on, which is how much it costs to reach the hardest to reach. And this is based on some data that we published in an article in the bulletin of the WHO, as well as in the Lancet. And it looks at, and this is based on real data in Latin America, it looks at the cost to deliver a sanitation intervention in a series of Latin American countries. And the bottom axis here is on population coverage, right? So you want to reach 100% of the population. And the vertical axis is cost per capita. And what we track is we look at the average cost, which is relatively flat over the course of the intervention. But what we're really interested in is the marginal cost, which is the additional cost that is the additional cost that is required to reach an additional person, right? So 50% plus 1, 75% plus 1, and so forth. And what this clearly demonstrates is that while reaching 50% coverage, your average cost and your marginal cost track relatively closely together. By the time you hit, say, 75% coverage, to reach 75% plus 1, your marginal cost will now be 2x over your average cost. And by the time you're actually reaching the very last person, i.e. reaching everyone, the marginal cost to reach that last person is 3.5x over your average cost, right? And for a whole host of reasons: transportation reasons, logistical reasons, policy reasons, training reasons, personnel, HR, and so forth. But for a whole host of reasons, reaching the hardest to reach actually becomes cost prohibitive. And this is the challenge, and this is also the opportunity. Because the key is, how do you narrow the gap between the marginal cost and average cost? Some of it is technological innovation, some of it is political processes, some of it is policies, some of it is programs, and so, et cetera. But what I want to get at here is that in order to reach that last person, in order to reach 100% coverage, universalism, what we actually need are targeted strategies that scaling up and replicating over the course of this cost curve is not going to be able to do it. We simply lack either the commercial, economic, or political will to actually achieve that. So let me say in conclusion, COVID has presented to us, I think, an opportunity where the clay is now soft. We can do things we probably could not have done before, right? So there is a real opportunity. There are a whole host of reasons to think that we won't do anything at all. In fact, history has suggested that we likely won't, but it's an opportunity that is before us. The second is to say that it's an opportunity for us to be much more innovative, right, in order for us to think about how we are going to reach and achieve real universalism. And it's not going to simply be about more technological innovation and so forth. It's actually going to require some real creativity in terms of our politics, in terms of policies, as well as in terms of our technologies. Third, it's also going to require political will. And this is really critical, right? Because there's really very little political incentive to engage in this type of, in addressing this cost problem that I presented to. So it's going to require generating political will. Some of it may be electoral returns. Some of it may require a new kind of ethical principled leadership. And this is where I think Japan is actually playing a very important role in terms of the way in which it can set the agenda at the G7. It can set the agenda in terms of broader global discussions around a principled ethical framework in order to motivate people, either for solidarity reasons or as well as political economic incentives to reach the hosts who are the hardest to reach. And the last thing I would simply say, addressing this now is absolutely critical as we think about the post-SDG or post-2030 agenda. The SDG agenda is one in which at least there is the axiomatic commitment of leaving no one behind. We're likely not going to reach those targets. So as we start thinking about post-2030 and the renewal of those targets, thinking about graphs like this, as well as the moment that we're in right now, strikes me as the best time to be resetting that agenda. And I can't imagine a more fruitful convening than one with Japan at the helm guiding us in that position. Thank you. Yeah.
Great, that was fantastic. We had 3 excellent presentations looking at everything from the institutional constraints of patent laws to the leadership shortcomings and challenges for countries trying to share and be benevolent, but sometimes not meeting expectations. And a broad synthesis about how do countries learn and how could we aspire to more targeted, more effective ways of achieving better outcomes. So across these presentations, we've heard a lot of rich commentary, and yet we also have many experts in the rooms who will have their own points to add. And so I am happy to open up now for a broader question and answer session. We're going to start off with one of our associates, Ji Mao, who is from the China Foreign Affairs University, where he is associate professor, and he has just arrived recently from China to join us here at the Harvard US-Japan Relations Program, where he's doing work on US, China, Japan leadership triangles. And he'll ask our first question, and then we'll move on.
Okay, thank you very much for Professor Davis for this giving me this chance, and thank you for the 3 speakers for your very informative and inspiring presentations, allowing us to learn the best practices and also maybe some lessons from different countries. So my question would be short. Despite the very intensifying global force for maybe competition, and also the narratives for a very politicized narrative, is there any possibility for maybe a kind of global health agenda that parallel the Tokyo Protocol and maybe Paris Agreement? Why is why isn't there a global health agenda resembling the one in the environmental or maybe climate change sector, so that can allow the help create a level playing field for competition, allow the different inclusive of different approaches in medicine markets, while also can work for different but common responsibility for maintaining or help the human security. Maybe what Wong has nicely put universalism or maybe convergence of different approaches. Thank you.
The global health agenda.
I guess I could start off by saying that there is in fact a global framework that has been pursued by the World Health Organization. Unfortunately, the money is all in the WTO. And so we have this global framework that is fragmented between those multilateral organizations. WTO is an example that is pursuing an agenda that is prevented from succeeding by the WTO TRIPS. And then we have a World Intellectual Property Rights Organization that is just sort of floundering in the wind. I mean, you know, theoretically, the WIPO should be responsible for global intellectual property rights, but Pfizer targeted the WTO because they knew they would have the power of the denial of market entry if their ideas were not, if they were not able to set the discourse. So it doesn't matter what the WHO and WIPO do in regards to setting a global framework when the entrenched interests that control access to medicines is in the WTO. I think that's the greatest challenge. And I won't even get started on the problematic things that go on in the UN, but you know, people doing the good work, but are working within a global system that where vested interests don't have the same desires.
Thank you very much.
I would qualify in thinking about the WTO versus WHO. It's very interesting to think, why would health be centered in the WTO? Now, first, it has no budget compared to the WHO. So at a budget of an organization, the WHO has more staff, more budget. The way the WTO matters is because the rules affect trade, and trade opens markets. So it's not that the organization has money, it's the markets. And then thinking about, why would a one country, one vote consensus organization have been manipulated by one company so effectively? And so that gets down to an interesting decision-making analysis of, you know, what was it that would have allowed that to have happened? And at the same time, when we think about the WHO that has come up short in that, Gmail's question of where's the global health agenda, you're not thinking the WHO is providing one. And there, why didn't China use its influence of having the Secretary General and try and have its vaccine rollout and its leadership more through the WHO? Why didn't the US or Japan, who provide a large share of WHO spending, think of mobilizing their leadership? I mean, it was interesting that Japan is using a global health innovative tech fund, not pushing through the WHO. So what is it that has led to the WHO not filling this vacuum of a global health agenda when everyone knows we need everyone participating to get a good response?
I guess that's the reality of the global health governance, that we have such a crowded governance space. Well, officially, WHO should play a central role, but that is not always the case, especially over issues like IP, right? You have the other entities, the private sector, WTO, that played a more salient role. That has unfortunately been there's this problem being exacerbated over the past 2 or 3 decades. In a way, more organizations, more initiatives created to tackle global health issues. Like HIV/AIDS, for example, used to be this area of WHO, right? But in a way, donors realized that the organization was not good at tackling that issue. Started to actually to create the other organizations, like the UN, UNAIDS, right? The Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. So we actually saw this hollowing out of these functions, that should be played by the WHO. So now we talk about HIV/AIDS, WHO basically has no say. One of the problems you're right is that even though it has its own budget, but really, if you look at the budget, the operating budget level of WHO, is actually no match of the the GM, General Massachusetts Hospital's budget. Can you imagine? Right? We have such numerous, but this large number of this global health challenges. That we expected the WHO to fix all this problem, but it has a very small budget, right? And most of this money actually 80% of the money actually called the earmarked money. That is, you cannot use, the WHO doesn't have the authority to decide how to use the money. So 80% of the money actually is essentially the donated or earmarked. So that created even a bigger problem. See, like polio, we have several hundred cases worldwide, but 26% of the WHO operating budget actually goes to polio eradication, and that because the donors want that.
And Joe, did the WHO play any role in that move from national variation in response to harmonization, or was that separate from coordinated global governance?
I tend to think of it as more as national responses, recognizing over time that these responses needed to be repeated. And so that's hard. I mean, when you start thinking that you have a raft of regulations, and you know that you're going to have to toggle and impose them, and then maybe release and then impose again, it actually starts narrowing down some of your options in terms of what it is that you're able to do. So I think there's a fair degree of just sort of domestic compliance that drives that. On the larger question, though, I mean, again, as we think of this post-pandemic moment, and I've stressed it as a moment because I don't want to suggest that that the world has become altered in any permanent way. I really do believe that if we don't take advantage of this moment, then things might just go back to how they were. But it does strike me that whereas we tended to think of global health, and we tend to think of national health systems and health systems strengthening, particularly in low and middle income countries, we've tended to think of health as a normative good. right? And the absence of or weaker health systems or those countries that required health system strengthening are a reflection of their level of development. And so it becomes a normative project around a good, and it becomes a project around development. And what we've seen, though, I think, is that in fact, global health can become a security threat, right? And that it in fact affects one's own national security, whether it be in terms of the health of your own population, whether it be in terms of disruption of supply chains, which then again has also a national security implication with respect to the strength of your economy. And I wonder if that might then change the way in which we think about the prospects of global health cooperation and collaboration, rather than thinking as a problem to be resolved elsewhere among poorer countries, but rather a collective good that actually strengthens our own national security. That might actually create the kinds of incentives that our neoliberal institutionalists have long argued in terms of multilateralism and collective security and so forth, these century-old ideas, but nonetheless pretty robust in terms of compelling and incentivizing countries to collaborate more often than not. Yeah, let's hope so, yeah.
Opening up to questions in the room. Eve Tabergan, an expert on both topics of our panels.
Thank you. So that was excellent. Thank you to the speakers. I'm actually working on the second volume of the COVID Paradox, the comparative COVID book. So I have a vaccine question, and this one part for Kathryn, one part for Yanzhong, and I guess for Joe, it will be for next round. I have two questions for him, but I'll keep them. But the vaccine is for Kathryn. The vaccine development with Pfizer and Moderna was linked to the state with the warp speed, the Operation Warp Speed. So in what was the impact of that? Did it, it gave an extra subsidy to companies that were making so much revenue afterwards, but did it tie their hands in cooperation? Were there some constraint in what they could do, say in China and whatever, or sharing the vaccine? And what do we learn from that? That's an unusual episode, right? And then related question, I guess, for you, but maybe also for Joe, is what happened with vaccine development in Korea and Japan? Why was vaccine development only in Europe and the US and China, and some extent Taiwan and Vietnam, and a bit India, but not Japan and Korea? And for Yanzhong, also on vaccine, what can we, how could we explain the vaccine delays in 2022? During nothing happening, basically the percentages are staying flat and the booster at 57%. But also there was this work on an mRNA vaccine in China all along. What do we know about it? And is that the reason why they delayed buying Moderna and Pfizer? Or was it linked to what we have learned from Kathryn about the exorbitant privilege of patents and the price, right? Thank you.
Big important questions, brief answers so that we can.
Very brief, and we can talk on the side, so I don't bore the audience at home with getting down in the deeps about warp speed and subsidies and government purchasing authorizations. I think the key answer with the Pfizer recipient of, I don't know exactly the number, but hundreds of millions of dollars under the warp speed policy, was that the US government would have then the first right to purchase. So to answer part of your question, yes, that certainly did affect who was able to get the Pfizer jab initially in the first months of the vaccine rollout. But that didn't affect in the second year of this now 4 years of the lingering pandemic. And then the question of mRNA vaccines, why didn't Korea or Japan? Let's not forget, that was not invented in the United States. It was the concept for it was invented by a Turkish-German immigrant to Germany, who, by the way, was a woman and really struggled to get tenure in her organization because she had this crazy idea about mRNA, and it challenged the hierarchy of what everyone else believed about what vaccines should be made of. So that invention was not even. Pfizer, to its credit, has a very rigorous assay which is a quality control process in its manufacturing, which is why Pfizer was able to target, to know that BioNTech was out there, first of all, but also target for acquisition that discovery, and then immediately begin producing a very high quality. I think some of the issues with some of the other vaccines, Moderna, for example, there have been all sorts of long-standing negative side effects, renal failure, for example. I hate to put that out there, but that's what the case study clinical data is saying right now. Yes, no, anyway, sorry, I just went on, but we can talk about it later.
You want me to, okay. For your question about this delay or lack of progress in vaccination, right? Then actually after, I believe, March 2022, right? China already achieved like close to 90% of the vaccination rate, which like that means close to 90% of the population had received at least 2 doses of the inactivated vaccines. But after that, we're seeing essentially, no progress, right? If you actually even look at the government provided data, right, for like 3 months, right, we didn't, between August and November 2022, there's almost no progress, right, in terms of the vaccination rate for the elderly. So that is very interesting. I think certainly, I think the main reason is because of zero COVID, right? Because the local governments essentially they found zero COVID very efficient, right, in stamping out any of the flare-ups, small outbreaks, just by mass PCR testing, quarantine, snap lockdowns. They were able to contain or cut the local transmission chain within like 1 month. They usually a couple of months. So there was this kind of belief, that the zero COVID is more efficient than vaccines, right? They contain the spread of the virus, that provide disincentives for local governments to promote, right, the vaccination, right, especially vaccination among the elderly. And then on the demand side, right, for the elderly people, they also created this false sense of security, right? So that we are very well protected by zero COVID, right? We're shielded from the virus. So why bother to get the vaccine, right? So this is a lack of progress, but that also explains why vaccination has not, essentially for 3 years was not a primary approach, for China's pandemic response. That also created disincentive to import the vaccines from overseas. But of course, there's nationalism. That's Kathryn's expertise. They just want to have their own homegrown mRNA vaccine.
Okay, well, much as I want to hear why we didn't get a vaccine in Japan, I also want to open up to get 2 more questions from the audience and then let you have a last remark. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, Trevor.
Just sort of a 2-finger use question, but question for Kathryn. So I hear what you're saying about sort of where the research was done, or sort of the idea for mRNA vaccines, but the development was done in sort of Germany and the United States, right? 2 countries with sort of robust patent protections as well as private health insurance, highly regulated, but effectively private health insurance. And often when you see sort of rankings of things like science and technology and healthcare innovations, often these countries that sort of rank first, right? Germany, Switzerland, the United States, the Netherlands, all of these kind of systems. So I was wondering if you could talk I'm playing devil's advocate here is really what I'm trying to do, but I was wondering if you could just respond to that kind of criticism about, what happens to this development without that system.
And before you do,
we want to get one question. Susan?
Well, I would put it even more strongly, and I second Christina's emphasis on the book. Let's come out of this seminar with an answer to why Japan didn't develop its own vaccine. Really, we can come out with a clear answer to that. But actually, picking up on the previous question, Pfizer ends up looking very good in this. It came up with a Pew survey shows it was the world's most trusted vaccine. And by the way, Moderna at the end of last year was the single worst performing stock on the stock exchange. So it's not as if all these companies do well here, but isn't Pfizer a case of the value of protection for the investment in this company? That IP has, in other words, value. We have many other problems, but let's think about Pfizer's performance here.
So wrapping those together, actually, I want to start with you, but I also want to make sure, Joe, you bring in on thinking about the targeting, and if you were thinking about how to create a better system for vaccine distribution, what's the public-private cooperation in the image? Because we sort of have this juxtaposition of, is the private sector the devil in the room causing problems? How can we harness that to work as a system? Starting off.
These are all very complex questions. I cannot answer why not Japan. That's the next book, right? But you know, my confidential and anonymized informants in the global pharma industry say that, in fact, the high prices they're able to gain in countries that do not have, so answering three questions at once, that do not have universal national healthcare systems, subsidize France, Germany, Japan, all the countries that do. So the pricing in the United States, which is astronomically high, could be millions of dollars a dose for some of these orphan protected drugs, particularly pediatric ones, which are very manipulative in terms of their pricing. But that's another conversation. Pfizer does look very good. And again, as I mentioned before, it's the ability to quickly make that investment in the production end of it, not in the invention part of it. So the innovation itself is not incentivized by patents, because the innovation occurs by scientists and entrepreneurially minded engineers, mostly at universities such as this one, but also MIT down the road, and many, many, many universities around the world where scientists are making those discoveries for human health, for public health, not to profit the global pharmaceutical industry. So the innovation is not incentivized by patents. And in fact, that's my next book project is questioning, should we have patents over living things and living matter? Because that's the trend now, is just to patent the entire living world around us, including our water, by the way, by powerful global companies, which is not good for human health. And I'll stop before you stop it.
But for Trevor's question, it was in the German and American high patent environment that we saw the development. So is this counterfactual of no patents? So Rosie.
That private markets are important, and having privatized insurance is also important in the innovation matrix.
Yeah, or that it broadly subsidizes systems that don't have that kind of extreme incentive based on kind of the high costs that you have to pay for these kinds of pharmaceuticals in countries like the United States. Does that subsidize it?
Right, but you're conflating Germany, which does have a universal healthcare system with, so the European countries and the Scandinavian countries, all, for the most part, all have. So putting Germany in the same bucket as the United States, I think, is not empirically.
Well, I think we can make a distinction between single payer healthcare systems and highly regulated private systems, like Switzerland or the Netherlands, or these.
And even a country like Japan, you know, we're all sponsored by the Japan Foundation here. So Japan is a very important universal healthcare system, but also has supplementary care that's available in the private market. And so Germany, I think the German and Japan model is closer together than the US model. But yes, you know, I mean, it's an empirical question, which I'm testing in my next book project. Do we actually need patents or not? So excellent putting that on the radar.
Very good. And what do you think about going forward for the global rollout of more vaccines?
Yeah. Again, if there's anything to take away from my comments, to say that we use this image of the clay is soft, which means that it will harden. And so if we can't extract the lessons that are important that can be learned from this this current pandemic, then we would really have lost a great opportunity, I think. In the case of the Ontario vaccine, there are lots of lessons to be learned with respect to, logistics management, particularly logistics optimization in these fly-in communities. Reducing waste was a very elaborate affair, as it turns out, and a lot of lessons were learned in terms of how do you reduce the waste after you've opened a crate of vaccines. How do you ensure that you use the most number of vaccines in a single clinic? So a lot of these kinds of lessons, I think, can be learned and codified and so forth moving forward. But it's difficult to do. People want to forget this as quickly as they possibly can.
So as scholars, we can't forget and should keep writing the books.
Yeah, I think so. Writing probably op-eds are a little bit more effective in terms of reaching our policymakers, I suspect.
Yanzhong, do you want to say any closing remark?
I have no further to add here.
Of course, your work at the Council on Foreign Relations, you probably reach a wider audience for very
I'm thinking maybe we could invite some of our speakers today to my roundtable.
Let's talk about the health of growth.
Yeah, or healthier growth, yes, another.
Yes. Great. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.